Picture a museum exhibit somewhere in the early 20th century, let's say 1909, which is when the most influential early Neanderthal reconstruction was published by the French paleontologist Marceline Boule. You are standing in front of a model or illustration of a Neanderthal man, and what you are looking at is a hunched, shuffling creature with bent knees that never fully straighten, a forward-jutting head hanging from a neck that angles rather than rises vertically, long arms swinging close to the ground, a slack-jawed expression suggesting cognitive vacancy, and an overall impression somewhere between an ape that learned to walk and a human being in the process of forgetting how. This image, Boule's reconstruction of the La Chapelle-aux-Saints Neanderthal, became the defining visual representation of Neanderthals in popular culture for most of the 20th century. It appeared in textbooks, in museum dioramas, in magazine illustrations, in film. It shaped the word Neanderthal as a cultural insult meaning brutish, stupid, and primitive in a way that persists to this day. It was taught to generations of students as the authoritative scientific picture of what our closest extinct relatives looked like and how they lived. It was also wrong. Spectacularly, comprehensively, almost impressively wrong. And the specific ways it was wrong, and why it was wrong, and how long the wrongness persisted despite accumulating contradictory evidence is one of the more revealing stories in the history of science, because it shows how initial assumptions, institutional inertia, and the very human tendency to see what we expect to see can distort scientific understanding of even the most physically concrete evidence. Boule's reconstruction had a specific and embarrassing problem at its literal foundation. The La Chapelle-aux-Saints individual, whose skeleton formed the basis of the reconstruction, had severe arthritis. The bent knee, forward-jutting posture that Boule interpreted as the typical Neanderthal stance was actually the posture of an elderly individual whose joints had been severely deformed by degenerative joint disease. Boule was not reconstructing a typical Neanderthal. He was reconstructing a specific old, arthritic Neanderthal and presenting it as the species type. This error was identified and published by other researchers as early as 1957, when William Strauss and A.J.E. Cave reanalyzed the La Chapelle skeleton and concluded that the individual's posture had been pathologically determined rather than species typical. They famously noted that if a Neanderthal were given a shave and modern clothing, he would attract no particular attention on the New York subway. Their reanalysis was published in a respected scientific journal. It should have corrected the record. It took another 30 years for the corrected understanding to substantially penetrate popular culture, and the caricature Boule established still haunts the word Neanderthal in common usage. This is the first and most foundational lie about Neanderthals, that they were stooped, shuffling, anatomically primitive creatures rather than fully upright, biomechanically modern bipeds whose posture was indistinguishable from that of anatomically modern humans. Neanderthals walked upright, completely upright. Their skeletal anatomy from the pelvis through the knee to the foot indicates fully modern bipedal locomotion, the same biomechanical system that modern humans use, with no structural evidence of the bent knee, forward-leaning gait that the early reconstructions depicted. The only thing that distinguished Neanderthal locomotion from modern human locomotion was that Neanderthal skeletons were substantially more robust, thicker bones, more developed muscle attachment sites, greater overall skeletal strength, indicating that Neanderthals were using their modern bipedal system to do significantly more physically demanding work than modern humans typically perform. The posture lie was foundational, but the intelligence lie has been more persistent and more damaging to accurate understanding. The portrayal of Neanderthals as cognitively primitive, barely conscious creatures, shuffling brutes who happened to make some simple tools out of undiscriminating instinct but lacked anything resembling genuine thought, planning, or inner life, has been one of the dominant misrepresentations in paleoanthropology for most of its history. Brain size evidence contradicts this immediately and dramatically. Neanderthal brain volume, measured from endocasts of their skulls, averaged between 1,300 and 1,600 cubic centimeters. Modern human brain volume averages approximately 1,350 cubic centimeters. Neanderthal brains were, on average, larger than modern human brains. Their brains had a different shape, more elongated and less globular than the modern human brain, with differences in the expansion of specific regions that may reflect different cognitive specializations. But the claim that Neanderthals were cognitively inferior to modern humans on the basis of brain size fails immediately because the size comparison goes in the wrong direction. Brain size is an imperfect proxy for intelligence even within a single species, and the differences in brain shape between Neanderthals and modern humans reflect real differences in the specific cognitive capacities that were emphasized in each lineage's evolution. The more globular modern human brain shows expansion in regions associated with social cognition, symbolic processing, and language-related functions. These differences are real and meaningful, but they do not translate into the simple hierarchy hierarchy that the Neanderthals were stupid narrative assume. They translate into different cognitive profiles, with different strengths and different emphases, in two closely related species that were living in different ecological contexts with different behavioral strategies. The archaeological record of Neanderthal behavior provides the most direct evidence against the intelligence lie, and what it shows is a behavioral repertoire far more sophisticated than the primitive brute stereotype accommodates. The Mousterian stone tool industry. The technological tradition associated with Neanderthals across Europe, the Middle East, and Western Asia has historically been dismissed as simple and unchanging compared to the upper Paleolithic industries associated with modern humans. This dismissal is not supported by detailed analysis. Mousterian tools include finely worked scrapers, points, and other implements produced through the Levallois technique, a sophisticated prepared core method in which the napper shapes the core before removal, in such a way that the resulting flake has a predetermined form. Levallois preparation requires mental representation of the intended final form and a multi-step production sequence planned in advance, not the random bashing of rocks that primitive brute stereotypes imply. Moreover, Neanderthals hafted their tools. They attached stone implements to wooden or bone handles using adhesives including birch tar and pine resin mixed with ochre and other compounds. Producing birch tar requires a specific pyrolysis process, heating birch bark to specific temperatures without combustion, that cannot be achieved accidentally and requires both understanding of the process and deliberate control of its conditions. Hafted tools are substantially more effective than unhafted implements for most uses, and the combination of prepared core tool production with hafting represents a sophisticated material technology requiring planning, multi-step production, and accumulated technical knowledge. Neanderthals used fire. This is established beyond any reasonable dispute by hearth evidence at Neanderthal sites across Europe and the Middle East, with fire use documented from well before 200,000 years ago. The use of fire for warmth, cooking, light, and potentially social gathering represents a major cognitive and behavioral achievement. It requires knowledge of fire-making techniques, judgment about appropriate fire placement, management of fuel and air supply, and awareness of fire's dangers as well as its benefits. The evidence for Neanderthal symbolic behavior is the most contested and most interesting dimension of the intelligence debate. Symbolic behavior, the use of arbitrary signs, decorations, or objects to represent meanings beyond their physical properties, has traditionally been considered a uniquely modern human cognitive capability, the behavioral expression of the distinctive modern human capacity for abstract thought. The evidence that Neanderthals were engaging in symbolic behavior has been accumulating for decades, and it is now substantial enough that dismissing it requires increasingly contorted arguments. Perforated shells, presumably used as ornaments, from Iberian sites predate the arrival of modern humans in the region. Pigment use, ochre, and manganese dioxide at Neanderthal sites predates modern human arrival in Europe. The Cueva de los Aviones in Spain has produced pierced and pigment-stained shells dated to approximately 115,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years before any modern human was in Europe. Cave art from multiple Spanish sites has been dated using uranium-thorium methods to periods when only Neanderthals were in Europe, a dating approach that does not depend on organic material and is therefore immune to the contamination issues that have complicated radiocarbon dating of cave art. A negative hand stencil, a ladder-shaped symbol, and other non-representational marks at sites including La Pasiega and Ardales have been dated to at least 65,000 years ago. If these dates hold, and they have been subjected to significant methodological scrutiny, they represent Neanderthal art, produced by creatures supposedly incapable of symbolic thought. Feather use at Neanderthal sites provides additional behavioral evidence challenging the cognitive inferiority narrative. Analysis of bird remains from numerous Neanderthal sites across Europe has identified a consistent pattern. The most commonly represented bird elements are wing bones bearing large flight feathers, specifically the primary and secondary feathers that are the most visually distinctive parts of the bird. The same species appear repeatedly: white-tailed eagles, bearded vultures, ravens, red-billed choughs. And in each case, the wing elements are overrepresented relative to what butchery for food would produce. The parsimonious interpretation is that Neanderthals were collecting large, visually striking feathers from specific bird species for decorative or symbolic purposes. Eagles and vultures produce impressive black, white, and brown feathers. Ravens produce dramatic, iridescent black feathers. The pattern of selective collection from specific species producing specific feather types, repeated across geographically widespread sites with no clear subsistence explanation, is behavioral evidence of aesthetic preference or symbolic value assignment, the kind of behavior that, when found found at modern human sites is immediately interpreted as evidence of symbolic cognition. Eagle talons with cut marks and evidence of cord attachment from the Krapina Neanderthal site in Croatia, dating to approximately 130,000 years ago, provide some of the oldest jewelry evidence of any hominin. The specific pattern of modification, cutting to remove talons while preserving them intact, with wear patterns consistent with stringing and wear as an ornament, is consistent with only one interpretation. Someone was making jewelry from eagle claws, and the someone was a Neanderthal. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The burial behavior of Neanderthals is another domain where the evidence has been contested, but where the accumulated picture supports genuine burial practice rather than accidental preservation. Deliberate burial of the dead, intentional placement of a body in a prepared depression, sometimes with associated objects, has been identified at multiple Neanderthal sites, including La Chapelle aux Saints, Shanidar Cave in Iraq, and La Ferracie in France. The evidence for intentional burial is not always unambiguous. Distinguishing deliberate burial from natural accumulation of skeletal material in cave deposits requires careful taphonomic analysis. But the accumulation of cases across multiple sites with multiple independent lines of evidence for intentional deposition is difficult to dismiss entirely. The famous flower burial at Shanidar Cave, the interpretation that pollen found with a Neanderthal burial represented flowers deliberately placed with the dead, has been disputed on the grounds that pollen could have been introduced by burrowing rodents rather than human intention. This specific claim may be correct, but the broader pattern of Neanderthal burial behavior, documented across multiple sites where the pollen explanation is unavailable, supports the conclusion that Neanderthals were engaging in treatment of their dead that went beyond simple discard. A behavior whose most parsimonious explanation involves some form of social significance assigned to the dead body, which is a form of symbolic thought. The social intelligence lie compounds the cognitive inferiority myth by portraying Neanderthals as solitary, unsocial, or only minimally cooperative creatures. The evidence against this is substantial and comes from multiple directions. The survival of severely disabled individuals in Neanderthal populations, most dramatically the La Chapelle aux Saints individual himself, who had lost most of his teeth and would have required help with food preparation to survive, demonstrates that Neanderthal groups were providing sustained care to individuals who could not fully care for themselves. An individual who has lost most of his teeth cannot effectively process the tough, raw animal food that constitutes most of a Neanderthal diet. Survival requires either pre-chewed food, cooked and softened food, or soft plant foods, any of which requires other group members to modify their behavior to accommodate the disabled individual's needs. The Shanidar 1 individual, an adult male who had survived severe arm amputation, head trauma that probably affected his vision, a withered arm, and degenerative joint disease, represents an even more dramatic case. This individual's multiple severe disabilities, combined with survival to relatively old age, implies sustained, active care from group members across an extended period. These were not creatures too cognitively or socially limited to recognize and respond to the needs of community members. Ancient DNA analysis has revealed family structures in Neanderthal populations that directly demonstrate social complexity. Analysis of genomes from the Chagirskaya cave. Neanderthal specimens in Siberia identified related individuals, a father and daughter buried in the same cave, along with other relatives including cousins, providing direct evidence of family groups as social units, and suggesting the possibility of deliberate family burial. The genetic analysis also revealed patterns consistent with female-biased dispersal between groups, females moving between communities at reproductive age, a form of exogamy that prevents inbreeding and requires the kind of intergroup social relationships that simple solitary or minimally social creatures would not maintain. The physical capacity lie. The portrayal of Neanderthals as somehow physically inferior to modern humans is perhaps the most easily dismissed and yet most persistently believed misconception. By virtually every skeletal metric of physical robusticity and strength, Neanderthals substantially exceeded modern humans. Their bone density was greater, their cortical bone was thicker, their muscle attachment sites were more developed, their grip strength inferred from hand anatomy exceeded modern human ranges. Their upper body strength, inferred from the cross-sectional geometry of arm bones, humans has been estimated by some researchers as exceeding the strongest modern human athletes. Neanderthals were not weaker or physically inferior to modern humans. They were dramatically more physically powerful, adapted to lives of sustained high-intensity physical effort in cold environments, hunting large dangerous prey at close range. The common framing that Neanderthals were somehow outcompeted by physically superior modern humans gets this dimension of the comparison backwards in the most straightforward possible way. Modern humans were the physically smaller, lighter, less robust, and by skeletal evidence, less physically powerful of the two species. The diet lie presents Neanderthals as simple, inflexible meat eaters who lacked the dietary creativity of modern humans. Stable isotope analysis of Neanderthal bones from multiple European sites has confirmed high trophic level signatures consistent with substantial meat consumption. They were apex predators, who ate significant quantities of large game. This part of the dietary picture is accurate, but the inflexibility component is not. Neanderthal sites across the Mediterranean region contain abundant plant food remains and charred seeds indicating plant food processing and consumption. Dental calculus analysis, studying the mineralized plaque preserved on Neanderthal teeth, has identified starch granules, plant fibers, and even evidence of cooking of specific plant foods at multiple Neanderthal sites. The dental calculus of the El Cedron Neanderthals in Spain contained chemical compounds derived from medicinal plants including yarrow and chamomile, plants with bitter, unpleasant taste that provide no nutritional value and that modern humans consume specifically for their medicinal properties. The most charitable interpretation is that Neanderthals were deliberately consuming medicinal plants for their therapeutic effects, a behavior implying both knowledge of plant properties beyond simple nutrition and the intentional self-medication of illness or injury. Self-medication with specific plants having demonstrated pharmaceutical properties is a behavior that would previously have been considered distinctively human, and that, if confirmed in Neanderthals, pushes the behavioral sophistication picture significantly further in the direction of cognitive complexity. The extinction lie is perhaps the most consequential for how Neanderthals are understood in popular culture. The narrative of Neanderthal extinction by modern humans, warfare, genocide, outcompetition so complete that Neanderthals simply disappeared, presents the relationship between the two species as a simple story of winners and losers, with modern humans triumphant and Neanderthals eliminated. The ancient DNA evidence has dismantled this narrative more thoroughly than any other. Modern humans outside of sub-Saharan Africa carry approximately 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA, a signal of interbreeding between Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans that required not just proximity, but sufficient social compatibility for mating to occur across the species boundary. Interbreeding of this kind is not compatible with a simple genocide narrative. The specific Neanderthal genetic variants retained in modern non-African genomes are informative about what Neanderthal ancestry contributed to modern human biology. Immune system genes, particularly genes involved in innate immune response to pathogen types common in Eurasian environments, are overrepresented among retained Neanderthal variants, suggesting that Neanderthal immune adaptations provided genuine fitness benefits to their modern human descendants. The high-altitude adaptation of Tibetans runs through Denisovan ancestry rather than Neanderthal, but the principle is the same. Archaic human genetic contributions to modern populations reflect adaptive introgression rather than random genetic noise. This genetic picture reframes the Neanderthal-modern human encounter fundamentally. Neanderthals were not simply eliminated. They were partially absorbed into the modern human gene pool through a period of coexistence that involved both competition and mating, and their genes continue to exist in the bodies of billions of living people. Every person reading or watching this who has non-African ancestry is carrying a small but real portion of Neanderthal genetic heritage. The full accounting of what we actually owe Neanderthal, in immune function, in the genetic adaptations that helped modern humans colonize Eurasian environments, in whatever other contributions their genetic legacy has made that researchers are still identifying, is a question that active research is still answering. But the direction of the answer is clear. Neanderthals were not simply losers who disappeared. They were contributors who were partially incorporated. The cumulative picture that emerges from correcting the foundational lies about Neanderthals is of a human species, and they were human in every meaningful biological and behavioral sense, that was cognitively sophisticated, socially complex, physically extraordinary, behaviorally flexible, and culturally rich enough to have developed what appear to be symbolic practices, aesthetic sensibilities, and medical knowledge. A species that cared for its disabled and elderly members, buried its dead with possible ritual significance, decorated itself with feathers and eagle talons and pigments, and eventually interbred with the modern humans who shared its world world and whose descendants carry its genetic legacy. The stooped, slack-jawed brute of Boulay's imagination was a projection of early 20th century assumptions about the linear progress of human evolution from primitive to civilized, filtered through the lens of a specific arthritic old man's skeleton. The actual Neanderthal, standing fully upright, with a brain slightly larger than yours, carrying a hafted spear whose birch tar adhesive required controlled pyrolysis to produce, wearing eagle feather ornaments, caring for an elderly relative who had survived decades of serious disability, was something considerably more interesting and considerably more difficult to comfortably other than the caricature allowed. The biggest lie about Neanderthals is the simplest one, that they were not really like us. The evidence says something much stranger and much more interesting. They were more like us than we wanted to admit, and we are more like them than we currently know.